Hello and welcome. My name is Anushka Soare, and I am the manager for learning and engagement programs here at Carnegie Hall, or here at Carnegie Hall from home. I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce you to our amazing artists for this panel discussion. Now, while some of you who are familiar with our Carnegie Hall Musical Explorers program may already know some of these artists, this panel is really the tip of the iceberg of what's to come for the rest of this week, which is going to be kicking off a lot of really deep and engaging conversations with these artists about how they present and interpret their genres and practices for the masses. So you're really in for a treat, and we're really so lucky to have them with us. So just to let you know how the flow of this is going to go, we're going to hear from them first as a group, and then towards the end we'll open up the Q&A to receive your questions and comments. But please, as things become top of mind for you, feel free to enter them into the chat window so that we can take them. So let me go ahead and introduce our wonderful and amazing artists, as I'm sure you're all itching to see and hear from them. We have first up Laith Siddiq, who will be talking to us about Arabic classical music.
Hi.
Hi there. We have Julia Gutierrez Rivera, who will be talking with us about the practices of bomba and plena. Etienne Charles, who will be teaching us about calypso and the traditions of calypso. We have Alucha Tsinadze, who will be teaching us about Georgian folk music. We have Chen Lo and Asante Amin, who together make up the duo Soul Science Lab. They'll be teaching us the traditions about the latest iteration of Black music, hip hop. And we have, last but not least, Martha Redbone, accompanied with her special guest and partner, Erin Whitby, who will be teaching us about the traditions of Native American music. So enough from me, because I know you want to hear from them. Let's go ahead and kick it off. As I said before, Musical Explorers is often really lauded as being a really exceptional at platforming artists' voices when presenting their music. So I'm curious from you guys, and let's start it off with Alucha. As artists, how have your stories and individual backgrounds influenced your musicianship?
Hello everyone. Thanks. I think that my work has been particularly inspired by the process of coming to this country, and basically, in one word, it would be being an immigrant. My family left Georgia when I was 8 years old, and so I had to start my life again in the U.S. And I was able to reconnect with Georgian culture and my family and my roots through the music, and then I've spent most of my adult life sharing that music here in the U.S. and sort of there's just been this almost like a trail. First the people came, and then over the years it's been me bringing this music, and I'm not the only person doing that, obviously, but I think that the overarching thing for me has been this process of being an immigrant and finding my voice here, but reaching back to Georgia for inspiration.
Anyone else care to jump in and answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Asante Amin, one half of Soul Science Lab. I think I'm a musician, multi-instrumentalist from New Orleans, Louisiana. So a lot of my worldview and perspective is characterized, I guess, as a Southerner, as a Black Southern man. And where I'm from, the tradition of playing music in the street, storytelling, and culture is just very rich. I think, too, as a musician, I got involved with music to begin to understand myself even more. As a Black man in America, due to historical factors, the enslavement of our people, we've been disconnected from our culture, our names, our practices in so many ways. So music for me has been about creating a bridge to those things that we've lost. And, in the spirit of Sankofa, just understanding that where we go is connected and predicated on where I've been. So it's about being creative and improving and innovating, but also doing that within the context of understanding and knowing my history.
I can jump in. Hi, everyone. I would say that what has inspired me is the preservation of our culture. I come from two bloodlines, Native American and African American in the Southeast, which many connecting histories. And basically, in a nutshell, what inspired me to share this music is because we are fighting for our existence. We're still as the indigenous people and the first peoples of this country, we're still trying to establish that we've always been here, that we still exist. And so when you have a world that you live in where we are all addicted to phenotypes and stereotypes and all of these things, which are why these movements are happening, in not just in the United States, but around the world, where Black and brown people are being marginalized. And in our case, as Indigenous people, being erased on paper and in real life. And so the importance of sharing that, not only the culture, but also informing people that we are still here, very much alive, and are in all facets. We're in every single field. We celebrate our music. We have our ceremonies. Many of us have lost languages over time, but we still know who we are. At home, I'm Cherokee, Shawnee, and Choctaw, and I was with my grandparents, and we are the Anichishwas. They call us the Anichishwa people. We're the bird clan and the keepers of the feather, and we come from Appalachia, and the original Cherokee Shawnee region is, Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee and North Carolina ridges, and that Black Mountain is the highest peak in the eastern seaboard, which I think might have something to do with being the keepers of the feathers, But anyways, that created the desire to share this information and to encourage people to kind of delve into their own histories, their own family stories, and also to recognize the ground that they stand on. And that's what I'm hoping that people can teach children about the towns that they're in and what there before them. So, yes.
Yeah, I think a lot of sharing histories and keeping traditions alive is very much such a big part of the power of what you do, and very much what a lot of our interested teachers are interested in doing as well. So I think that's going to be a concept that continues to come back throughout the workshop. My next question is really about the methods in which a lot of your practices are taught, because what the whole reason for this workshop is that we're trying to platform and highlight non-Western classical pieces of music, classical and non-Western classical genres. So I'm curious if you can just talk a little bit about what are some of the methods of learning that are unique to your practice, and if there's anything that crosses over into other genres and practices. We've talked about it as a group, but I'm sure a lot of people would like to hear as well. Etienne, why don't we start with you?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear us, Etienne?
Yeah, I missed the last part of what you just said about practice.
Not a problem. I'm happy to repeat
I
it.
was plugging in my headphones. Sorry about it.
No worries. What my question was, what are some of the methods of learning that are unique to your practice, and what crosses over to other genres and practices?
Right. So specifically with Calypso, it's a 100% oral tradition. From the standpoint of the music being created and passed on strictly in oral traditions. I mean, we had it in schools as well, but it was still the oral tradition. We learned by listening to recordings. We learned by listening to the elders, discuss the topics that we were then supposed to engage with people through song. And as a result of that, the way that that ties into other art forms, I would think of most West African diaspora practices and also East African diaspora cultural practices. Like I'm naturally I could think about things like bomba in Puerto Rico. Shout out to Loisa. I would always think about places like Afro-Peruvian culture, where the music is specifically, a lot of times you see families that practice it. And so you kind of learn it in your family. So you're not thinking about it as I didn't think about it as something that was educational at the time, but now that I look back on it, it was really a strong education because it was just going straight from one mind to another. So that's the connection that we see.
I completely agree with what you said, Etienne. Looking at the way I grew up, I learned the violin at the conservatory. But then coming from the Arab world, growing up in Jordan, being raised in Baghdad, my education in Arabic music was at the house. It was a community getting together, like a house party, and then sharing songs and poetry and so on. And that was really what I learned. It was the oral tradition. I think this is a common theme that unites all our musics, where it wasn't really written in books, and it's just mostly shared around the hearth, or the idea of sitting around a fire or a food table, and just passing down the tradition.
If I can add, I can relate to both what Leif just said, but also kind of vibing off specifically on Etienne's observation is, yes, and thank you for mentioning bomba, right? Because that's my thing. These are traditions, these are expressions that are passed down internally from one community practice and family practitioners to another generation. They're very much oral-based histories. These are practices that have not been highly documented for a lot of socio-political and obviously racial reasons, which we don't necessarily have to go in now. But as a child of the diaspora, I'm born and raised in New York City. I was born within these traditions in East Harlem, in the South Bronx, and we were learning at first within a community-based setting. So it was very much that kind of mentor-apprentice relationship. But being outside of our home country, our home base, and also being exposed to urban influences in other communities and other cultures, we also had to find ways in which we can find a common language, right? So understanding, again, what is the relationship between calypso and bomba without even inherently knowing that. It's just we got together, we played and say, oh, this is the same rhythm, this is the same melody. And we learned a little bit more about our practices because of the diversity that it has. And I can really go on through there, but I won't take up any more time.
You can if you'd like, if you're on a roll.
But to jump in, hip hop is the same way. I mean, we're talking about oral traditions of the diaspora, and hip hop being, one of the current and contemporary children of diasporic music. Hip hop definitely is an oral tradition. I didn't learn hip hop studying in the conservatory. The conservatory was the cipher. The conservatory was, other friends who were trying to sharpen each other in all of the different skill sets involved in hip hop and hip hop culture. And so listening to what Julia is saying, Etienne is saying, what Leif is saying, definitely these are things that bind our traditions. This oral passing down of, historical traditions of the art form, of the skill, is the way that these things are traditionally given. It isn't until now that, hip hop artists or people who are, creators, and practitioners of hip hop are now beginning to actually, systematize the way in which things are created. Hip hop also, as with many other things, is so steeped in improvisation and experimentation. Is that you learn by experimenting. So many pieces of so many instruments, electronic instruments, drum machines, sequencers were created as a result of people, working in hip hop culture and hacking things that existed, to use them in a way that they weren't traditionally used in before. And so, it is about this connection to the past and this oral tradition, but it's also about experimenting to push things into the future, and creating something totally brand new,
from sampling, you know, what you learned and from standing on the shoulders of others that came before you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
100%, absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting because also like Georgian music is traditionally oral tradition, and but my parents were like physicists, so they didn't teach me any Georgian music. And obviously, like coming to the U.S., I didn't know any other Georgians, and so I've had to learn a lot of the songs through recordings in a way that's not traditional. But I found that over the years, I've made a lot of relationships with people in Georgia, and those relationships are what really let me pursue this music in a serious way. It's meeting the musicians there when I traveled back, and then them sending me songs or hanging out together and teaching me songs in those group settings. So it seems like even if you leave the country, you still have to make those relationships after a while.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That would actually bring me, if I may jump in. It kind of makes me think when you talk about the people, as obviously you can probably hear my accent, so I'm not Native American. In fact, I probably come from the most epically ignorant place about anything to do with Native America. So, but I've been with Martha for a very long time, and I guess it seemed to me that one of the most fundamental things about learning anything about the music was that you have to learn the culture too, and you have to meet the people. So even if it may start from recordings, eventually it's going to lead you deeper into it, because the music is, you can't really learn the music, I don't think, in any way successfully or without understanding the people and the culture it comes from, and that's the same. You know, I started off as a jazz. You know, that's my main journey, and it was similar in jazz. I don't think this is you can't just simply get the records and learn some lines. It's much deeper than that. So that was what I wanted to add there.
Amen.
Thank you. Alusha, I liked what you were saying about going back to Georgia and continuing to forge these relationships to continue carrying these traditions forward. And which brings me to my next question about being the culture bearers of the genres and practices that we've put on our website about you and what you've all been practicing for several years. So I'm curious about, what do you feel like your responsibilities are as culture bearers of your practices? And also, what do you prefer not to carry or choose not to carry? And what would you prefer not to have others assume about your practice? Julia, why don't we start with you?
That's a really deep question. And I wrote a bunch of notes, which I will probably not get to. But I think that, first of all, having, I want to say the words privilege and honor to be a practitioner is something that I carry with a lot of pride. It's definitely not a practice that for me is frivolous at all. And we've spoken about this numerous times since we first started planning, is that, yes, this is a musical expression. These are dance forms, these are songs, but this is a practice for us because it permeates all aspects of our lives. From the moment we wake up, if we are inspired with a melody and that translates into a song, and then we investigate that song and it's like, oh, that's an ancestral lesson, you know, from who knows when, that we didn't even know that is something that we carried in our bloodlines, but they're messages that consistently come through all the time, to how we dress or when we eat and where we eat and why we eat, all this stuff. It's definitely something that kind of dictates your life in a way that is a humbling process, but also an honoring journey to take on. So to be able to call myself a bombera and a plenera is not a title that I just fling around, casually. But I think that that kind of brings me to understanding what are the core responsibilities of this, is because of the weights and all the ancestral knowledge and the process and the traditions that this comes with. You know, when you walk into a space in that role or that kind of function of being a bombera, an educator, you're not walking in as yourself, you're walking in as the entire community and as that practice. So you have to kind of put that in check first, right? And what is it that you choose to represent, and how are you going to represent that, not only for those people that came before you, but for the people that you're trying to engage and encourage to walk that path as well, right? So for me, in terms of, I guess, 3 pillars, and I don't want to mention them necessarily in an hierarchical form, but they're all kind of processes and practices that are very critical to living this life, is constantly learning. You know, just because me personally, I've been in this since I was 2 years old. I'm going to be 38 this year, so you guys do the math. Several decades. I'm constantly learning. Constantly. Never assume that just because you're labeled a bombera or a master this and you traveled all over the world that you know everything. No, you don't. You know, first of all, these are old traditions. A lot of it has not been documented, and these are also living traditions. They shift and they evolve as you continue to walk that path. So you're always constantly learning. Performing is also really important, I think, specifically within diaspora communities and for cultural practices that are not necessarily commercial and that are not accessible to massive, I guess, media outlets, right? Your responsibility is to try to kind of engage new audiences and new communities to understand, specifically me talking about Bomba en Plena, what the history is of Puerto Rico, what the history is of Bomba, what the history of Plena is. And to know that, again, you have to be able to do that, you have to know that. And then finally, and I think it's the reason why we're here, is teaching, right? These traditions don't exist within yourself or within the small hub or community that you practice this in, right? You have to kind of share this with another. Bomba en Plena is not a practice of one person. There's multiple instruments, there's multiple roles. So in that essence, you have to be able to gather individuals, you have to be able to gather community, and in that is that inherent process of teaching. And again, that's a lifelong process, and all of these kind of feed into one another. So I'm going to pause because, yeah, I'm going to pause.
I could weigh in. I absolutely.
That was heavy. That was.
To add to Julia's, that's exactly, is really inspiring. I was raised by my grandparents, and we were raised in a traditional way. And so even being half Black, having my parents divorced when I was very young. And so in a way, I lost my dad, but I gained grandparents and culture. And so, in our communities, with as far as oral traditions, that's very true. But when you're storytellers, my grandmother was a storyteller, and so these things are passed down. Not everybody has this role in the community. People are given certain things to carry on, certain traditions to carry on, and I think mine is the voice, and the songs and the stories. And in fact, my Indian name is Sapatishwanu Pat, which is Red Whistle Woman, and the whistle comes from the song that is sung from the collarbone of the eagle that is sacrificed at the end of our ceremonies, that say that all our prayers are done and the families are safe to return back to their homelands. So. And I think this is just something that I felt, I guess it was a very profound moment, because when I was in middle school is when I left Kentucky and came back to Brooklyn, found myself in Brooklyn, New York, in the hood, and where that was the beginning of hip hop. So I'm giving away my age, as far as I'm going. But I, in the beginning of that, I remember, I came back to New York City to a house, where I had a single mom, and the only remnants of my dad was a piano and a stereo, an old big stereo console with a bunch of records. And I still have those records right over here. You know, I have like classic records that my dad collected. And so I remember playing some of those records. And one of the times that we were singing, was dancing to James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. And we were trying to do all the Soul Train dances that we watched on TV and everything. And then my mom, at the end of that record, she says, "Oh, so that's all you are? You're only proud to be Black? What, don't I have something?" And we were like, "Oh, you know." And she said, "You know, do not participate in the genocide of your own people.
Wow.
Don't erase us." And that, I guess when I was that age, that was the first time I've heard that, but I've heard that several times from many people in the Native community, especially us from the East Coast. We call it the Eastern Woodlands, people who are mixed with African American. And because of that phenotype, our indigeneity is taken away from us by people who are in search of what they deem to be as authentic Native Americans. And so also, not only through my storytelling, but it is almost I feel like it's my responsibility to redefine what it means to be Indigenous, Native American, Southeastern Woodlands in the 21st century, because these old romantic visions and these old relics of the past is not the truth. They're not the truth. There's only a tiny piece of that. And I think we're all guilty of being addicted to those Edward G. Curtis photographs. And we have to change that, because we're so much bigger than that as people, as a nation. So many nations of the American Indians across the country, you know, 574 tribes, 62, you know, state recognized tribes. I mean, we are people with all different languages and dialects, and cultures and stories and songs and families to share. And this is vital. It's so rich. Every region that teachers live in, any city that a teacher lives in, there's a story that begins there, and you can research. Kids will love discovering who the original caretakers of the land are, and what do they see around, what's indigeneity that they see around their neighborhoods. Are there street signs? Are there parks? Are there things in shops? You know, it's so rich. So there's a lot to discover.
Martin.
Dope.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Dope.
Powerful.
Like that.
Really amazing. I mean,
Really
just
Go ahead, Shannon.
jump in. But just to jump in and add on in terms of responsibilities and, you know, what we wouldn't want others to assume about our art form and our practice. I think hip hop music traditionally has been commercialized, commodified in popular culture. And so people assume that it doesn't have a long tradition, a long-standing tradition. It doesn't come from anything, that it doesn't have any roots. And so, you know, they tend to look at it as this flash in the pan fad, you know, that's short-lived and that will continue to have a short life, instead of really steeping themselves in the rich cultural traditions that come before it, that many of us have already spoken about. And so just making that assumption, because I think that in making that assumption, particularly if you're teaching young people who practice that tradition, you know, who are steeped in that tradition, who love hip hop music, you know, you may look at them the way that you look at hip hop if you don't think that it comes from anything, if you don't think that it has deep, long-standing roots, you know, that go, you know, from soul back to blues, back to jazz, back to ragtime, back to, you know, Negro spirituals, back to West African griot traditions in Mali and Senegal and Gambia and further. And so it's really important to understand that. And then in terms of responsibility, you know, because it's been commodified, it may be looked at as, you know, art for art's sake. And it definitely isn't that, because if you understand, you know, anything about the West African Jali or, you know, the Jewel or any of the oral traditions we're speaking about, you know, that every time, anytime those individuals open their mouths to speak, it was purposeful. They understood, you know, they understood just the power of word sound power, the ability to, like, you know, use repetition, to use call and response, to use, you know, words and rhythm to actually manifest reality. When we talk about all these traditions from, you the African diaspora, like that is what it comes from. And so when you talk about responsibility and, you talk about the words that you say and the words that you say with meaning over rhythm, you're speaking about, creating cycles in people's lives. You're speaking about influencing people's behavior. And so, as a practitioner, I look at that as like divine purpose. It's like I've been given a gift to use this art form, and I have to use it in the way that it was traditionally intended, and that's as cultural preservation, as maintenance, as upliftment, empowerment, and just to help keep the culture alive and keep it vibrant and keep it surviving. So yeah, I think that it's beautiful even in the context of this conversation. Like we've spoken, all of us have spoken, but we're having another conversation here, and hopefully, it's coming across the people who are watching, just in the connections, between what we practice and what we love.
Yeah, and it's wonderful to hear from you guys as you were saying, Chen, of the practitioners of these genres. I think hearing from all of our teachers who are here have probably a lot of the same questions about the responsibility that they carry as teachers, as not being practitioners of these genres. So I wanted to dive into that a little bit to really start approaching some of the questions that many of our teachers must be asking and why they're attending this workshop. So my next question is, what are the responsibilities that teachers carry when bringing these practices into their classroom? And how does one balance the line between cultural appropriation and valid messenger? We've already had a lot of conversation in Slack about white savior and what that means. So I'm curious to hear your take on that. And Martha, could we start with you about this?
Sure. I think, well, first of all, thanks to this very unique program here at Carnegie Hall, where you are going to the sources of the people of the communities to share their stories about where they come from. I think that is the key to everything. I think that if someone is wondering about whether or not they're appropriating, then I think you have to ask the people. It's the people in the community who you're appropriating it from who will let you know whether or not this is the right thing to do. There's a lot of the songs that we share, that we will share, and the music that we'll share are particular songs that these are social dances that I'll be sharing with you, and these are songs that you will be able to hear if you went to, any social dance, Southeastern social dance, or any gathering, or sometimes you might see them in a museum, during a fair or a festival, a summer festival. And so these are things where the songs that people will be learning will be songs that we have been allowed to share outside of our communities. So there's a lot of word, the big word that seems to float around a lot in and around Indian country is the word sacred. And people say, oh, you can't do that, that's sacred. Or you can't wear that, that's sacred. But, you can't wear, buckskin or fringes or whatever, that's sacred. It's not sacred, because if it were sacred, then it wouldn't be allowed to be in ceremonies. In contests, in dance contests, during the powwows. So this word sacred, if something is sacred, you wouldn't know it because we don't share it. We're not allowed to. The prayers and our ceremonies and things, they're only certain things that people outside of the community are allowed to share. And we are taught those things very specifically of what we're allowed to bring outside. With it, as far as being with the African American traditions and culture that happened in the Southeast that meld with the Native American tribes down there, there's something where in the social dances, there's the style is call and response, which comes from Africa. That's the African tradition. And so when they came to the Choctaw people, when they came to all the Gulf Coast nations. That is something that has happened over time as the communities were together, you know. And what was that?
Evolution.
Yes, it's kind of what we call the cultural evolution, you know. So when someone is talking about, that's why I talk about this word authenticity. It's a dangerous word to use, because the intention behind that, what is that word? That word authenticity comes from a European mindset that there is only one particular way, and that rigid way of stems from the kind of ideas of Christianity of the early days, and it leads back to all kinds of history, the doctrine of discovery and what's right in the eyes of the church, and what people are allowed to do in the eyes of the church, and to be closer to God, and this kind of stuff. And so, you know, these were things that were kind of bestowed upon us during colonization. So there are certain things that are still stuck in our minds just because it's become part of our natural language. And I feel that we are trying, as Indigenous people, we as African, you know, people, we are trying to undo a lot of those things and redefine them, because that's not the way that we were, and that's not the way that we are. You know, when we talk about Native American culture, when you say, you know, I say I'm African American, no one questions it, ever, right? I say I'm Native American, they say how much? So Native Americans are the only humans that have to have the same pedigree as a dog and a horse, you know. Only other people must be royalty, you know, who have to prove
But
their
they
pedigree.
are horses, mostly. Certainly where I come from, they are part horse.
So, you know, when you have people who are, you have a society that has spent centuries dissecting us like a butcher shop and saying what you're allowed to be, and then putting that on paper and making that what it is. How can we put ourselves together when we've been like scattered like the scarecrow? Do you know what I mean? So these are things that we have to put right. And the only way that I can do that is to share the stories that happened from my people and how I was raised, and encourage people, teachers, to discover, to teach the children, and also for themselves to learn more about the land that they stand on, you know, because it's so rich, and all of it is there, and it's right there in front of it, and it's always been there. It's just that we have to, I'm hoping to teach people how to look, not as well as listen, but it's also to look at something in a different way, something they've been staring at all along and didn't realize.
Thank you so much, Martha. That was really
that was heavy.
Everything that we needed to do.
It was over 2 minutes. I'm sorry.
All of it was valid and then poignant.
Wow.
So thank you.
That was good. That was good.
So move on to our next question. So I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges that our teachers are facing when introducing music from around the world to their students, given that most of our teachers' backgrounds are Western classical music training? And I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to you, Laith, for this.
Thank you, Anushka. I think, you know, one of the main reasons that come to mind is the lack of resources, and this is really important, and why these workshops are so wonderful and important. But also the power of Western classical music, and how it really became one of the most important ways to teach and learn music and to become successful at it. And it really is a kind of a colonization that, you know, many students, including myself and in all parts of the world, learn how to play Mozart before they learn about the music of their roots and where they're from. And, you know, I come from this background. I grew up studying the violin at the conservatory in Jordan. I played my Bach, my Mozart, my scales. I went through the same system. But at the same time, as I said, Arabic music was always at the house. In house parties, in special events, it was an important part of my childhood. So I grew up in both worlds, and I'm really lucky and I appreciate the beauty in both. But there are three main elements that come to mind that really differentiate those two styles. And we touched upon some of them in this conversation. The improvisation, the oral tradition, but also the microtonality, the non-tempered system. So while studying Western classical music, I rarely, if never, used these three elements in the classroom, even while being in the Middle East at the time. Everything was written down, which takes away the improvisation and oral element. and everything was tempered, so there's no macrotonality, which is an essential element to Arabic music. And these are such important elements that have freed me as an artist to fully express myself and my story. And although these things can oftentimes, they can be scary to educators because these elements are not well integrated into our music systems today. And I'm speaking from someone in the Middle East, so imagine how it is in Europe and in the US. Because improvisation did occur in the time of Bach, we all know that. And it was an oral tradition also before being written down in books. And microtones did exist before the tempered instruments. Actually, it's a funny story. Oftentimes I'm walking in New York City and I stop for a second and I hear an electricity kind of humming. And it keeps happening in different places. And I calculated that note, and it's actually a B half flat, which is a quarter tone. And it's always around us. It's always there. And through my workshop this week, I'll be going through these elements and the things that make Arabic music what it is, and helping guide the participants in building a bridge between these elements and whatever music background they come from.
Thank you, Laith. I think all of us in New York are very familiar with that that tone that we constantly hear as well.
That's why.
So again, I think a lot of the questions that a lot of our teachers have are really about how they bring themselves to this music that they are seeking to possibly present. So my last question for the group is, how can one's own background, musical or otherwise, get in their own way? And what would you encourage to overcome these barriers? I'll go ahead and kick it to Soul Science Lab, Asante and Chen, either one of you who would like to kick that off.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Anushka, and just all of the information being shared on this broadcast. But I think, generally speaking, we don't think about it in such a way. We usually think about education, academia as something you utilize in order to go get a job. But education is totally about storytelling. It's about telling the stories of a society, a community, and people's families. So even in that sense, we have to understand that the students or the people we interface with, they're all potential anthropologists, data scientists, musicians, educators themselves. And I think generally in the course of a conversation, if the only person you hear and see is yourself, there's a problem in that. So even myself in my own educational practices, I have to challenge myself. I have to constantly query my own biases and stereotypes, even working with my people, working with young people in particular, and to ask myself, am I looking at myself and my children from a Western lens, from a European lens? As we've kind of surfaced in different ways, if you have stereotypes and biases about a particular genre, most likely you have a stereotype and a bias about the people who created that genre of music. So I think it's very quintessential to understand that even as you go into an educational environment, that the students or the people you're going there to try to instruct, they are scholars in their own right. They have a worldview in their own right. And there's things they can teach you. Dr. Connie earlier today said something that just kind of stayed with me, but she said it's very important to decenter yourself and to feel as if everything you say is the most important thing. And I think that's essential because we all are centered in a perspective and a view in a community, but it's kind of like a constellation. Like I'm on my planet, but there are other planets in this galaxy that fill up the night sky. And I think it's really important always to understand who we are and what we are, but also in proximity to other people and what they do. And I think, again, talking about hip hop, one of the things I love about hip hop, we talked about genre and music being kind of facilitated in a communal setting, so much so that you didn't even realize you were learning because it was a lifestyle. And when I think about hip hop and the fact that many of our communities have kind of been broken down, our family structures have been broken away, and that family is not always there. We found family in each other. We found family in a cipher. We found family in making a circle with each other and learning that way. So even as I go into a classroom, those are methodologies I try to implement just to immediately break up traditional Western schematics of how we learn and interact, and understand that I'm a person, a part of the circle, just like this student. They have valuable insights to bring to the table, and it's super essential that I allow myself to be influenced by them if I want them to be influenced by what I bring to the table.
And just to quickly add on to what Asante said, well put, my brother. He spoke initially about storytelling, and my uncle, who's a musician who inspired me to become one as well, used to always tell me, if there is no story, there is no song. And all of us come from traditions. All of us come from families that have stories, and those stories oftentimes overlap. Those stories intersect. Having the opportunity to travel the world, and I'm sure many people on this panel can attest. When I traveled, the thing that I began to see when I stayed in places for long periods of time was, the cycles of life that reflected the cycles of life of where I came from. The language may have been different, the landscape may have been different, but I saw parents taking their children to school. I saw, families being families, kids being kids. And so, when you allow yourself to dig into another tradition from a space of empathy, of finding the stories that align and connect, as opposed to this foreign thing that I have to try to study, and dissect and analyze, but no, there are people connected to this tradition who, live and breathe just as I do, that have, traditions just as I do, that use this music and use this practice to reflect their lives and their traditions just as I do. I think that's the place, that allows you to get out of the way, because we all have that in common. And as well, I don't think it's about being an expert, but I think it's about giving everything context. I know sometimes teachers are scared of just cultural voyeurism or appropriation, and that's real. That's very real, especially in Western society. But if you come to it from a place of empathy, if you come to it from a place of giving things their proper context, don't just do a Wikipedia search about hip hop or about boomba or about calypso, or any of the traditions being expressed here. Do your due diligence. We've all provided additional resources to help you dive deeper, and to get a better context that you can share with young people. And even when studying something like hip hop, that may not have been you may not have been given information about in your music courses or in a conservatory or what have you. Hip hop has sampled almost every genre on planet Earth. Hip hop has connected itself to classical music, has connected itself to jazz, has connected itself to whatever genre that you can think of around the world. And so you can use that as an entry point for you and your students to explore that form of music and to see the way in which it parallels, connects, and aligns.
Mm-hmm.
And just to quickly add to that point, I think it's always okay as an educator to walk into the classroom and make it known what you don't know. It's okay. I think a lot of times we feel as
Absolutely.
if, again, going back to a Eurocentric model of there has to be an authority and it has to be a top-down approach. And I think more the indigenous Aboriginal perspective, again, even about education and is reciprocal. Mm-hmm. It's a flow back and forth. It's rhythm involved. So, one of the things I love to do when I'm working with my young people is to find out what they're listening to. Is to ask them what they're listening to so I can understand how to make those connections toward things they may not want to naturally know about, to exhibit and demonstrate how really, like, this thing you may be turned off by, it actually is connected to the thing you love. It's actually you in a different time period. And so one of the things I love to do is to maybe facilitate and curate language or methods through which we can investigate together. And we can all learn. I think that's really essentially and key, not only in the educational environment, but when you walk on a bandstand as a musician. I think it's really important to just listen, read the room, realize you don't know it all. You have a perspective, but other people have perspectives too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, Aaron, I do want to get to the Q&A portion of this because we have a lot of amazing questions coming in on the YouTube channel. So I want to make sure that we're getting to as many of them as possible. So I know that everyone wants to hear from the artists. And as we said before, make sure you follow up with them on Slack if you want to continue the conversation. Mm-hmm. But we're going to go ahead and jump into some of these questions that have come in. So this came in from Lori. She said that as a classically trained musician, how can I come out of my comfort zone when teaching music with oral traditions? I spend less time on music that I'm less familiar with and wish to change that. And anyone can dive in and answer that.
Well, I was kind of a little bit to where I was talking about what I was about to say, which was about learning if you're not used to improvising. Because I think that as a musician, I mean, we can all challenge ourselves, and I think I've come across. I've had a few occasions where I've kind of been on a show or something with some classical musicians and tried to jam, and they didn't know, felt they couldn't do that, which was kind of a little remarkable because they're incredible musicians. And my experience was always but if you kind of made it really simple for them, then they discovered they could. And I think so for someone, a teacher who might feel they can't do it, and therefore they can't teach it, is to allow themselves to actually do it. Often it's really just, it's like, it's almost like just allowing yourself and to make the mistakes. I mean, on a very practical level, I remember playing with this remarkable violinist, and he said he couldn't jam. And I said, well, do you know C minor harmonic? And he said, of course I know, and it's like, all right, there we go. And I just put something, a little rhythm underneath him, and he, within a few minutes, he was really, kind of got quite emotional, because it's like, wow, I've been playing this for 30 years. I didn't know I could make my own melodies. So I think it's a really allowing yourself, because you can do it. We improvise when we talk every second of the day, it's really the same thing. So I think it's quite possible for teachers to do that if they allow themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we learn by failure, by making mistakes, right? I mean, that's part of the process. I'm not a musician, I'm a dancer. So I can probably speak to some of my best moves have been accidental. Either I tripped over something, like, oh, I caught my balance, and that became like a signature move. The wind blew in and blew my skirt over, and it's like, oh, that's another signature move. Those are mistakes. It's like being able to thrive in those spaces of vulnerability, I think, is what is going to allow you to embrace alternative methods of practice, alternative genres of expression, and just kind of understanding that as a teacher, you're on that same level with your students, right? You're all on this journey together. We're learning it together. I just want to kind of share a little bit about something that my dad does a lot, with his group. The group is Los Pleneros de la 21, that we play both bomba and plena, and the sounds of the group includes the traditional expressions along with jazz influences. And so he's known to bring in a lot of notable jazz musicians into the ensemble. And it's always really funny to see in those first rehearsals, those musicians kind of stumble because the sheet music is not precisely written. It's like, wait, what do I play? He just says, you know what, forget about the sheet music, just feel it. You know the notes, you know how to play them. All you have to do is just intuit and respond to what's happening in the room, right? So there's a combination of being willing to fail and trusting your human and emotional instinct that you have. As classically trained musicians, you have a benefit of a written code that can help articulate that improvisational nature.
Yeah, I like that.
Can I jump in, or next question? Could I jump in, or we got another question?
Jump in, Etienne. We want to hear from you.
Yeah, I'm just loving what everybody's saying, but this question is really special because it's a question that comes up all the time. And the most important thing about one, learning a style to then teach a style is I would say put your body into it, especially if you're coming from like a Western European quote unquote classical tradition. You have to kind of like completely deprogram the way you think and the way you feel music, and try, depending on where you live, understand that there are immigrant communities everywhere in the United States, and there's probably and because of globalization and because of education, there's probably a practitioner in your town. I would say try to, all of these musics that we're studying here are tied to social rituals, and they're tied to community activities, whether for uplifting, whether for a celebration, whether it's for a mourning. Try to experience the ritual. If you can experience the ritual, you'll understand that the music is just one element in a bigger picture. And once you can picture that, because I've done it many times with different styles that I wasn't familiar with, and I always learn by traveling. So I will go to Benin, I'll go to Alada, I will go to Lomé, Togo, I'll go to Essaouira to learn about Gnawa, and so like the ultimate way to learn is by traveling. But if traveling is not like impossible now, but try to find people in your town that are connected to that culture and go see the ritual, be a part of it, humble yourself. Don't ask questions from the perspective of what you know. Ask questions from the perspective of how you are supposed to come to it. And immediately you're able to tell the story a different way to your students, and they will immediately see the excitement in your eyes and see the understanding that comes through your body when you're in the classroom with them. And then once you also let them know that this is not something that is supposed to happen in a classroom, it's really important that they get that from it. And once you do that, it's immediately a lot more powerful what comes across.
Thanks, Etienne, and everybody. I'm going to dive into the next question because we have some others coming in. One person said, how do you have students and administrators value teaching music and culture orally through storytelling?
Show them the results.
I don't quite understand that.
Yeah,
Can you repeat that?
I can repeat it, yeah. How do you have students and administrators value the teaching of music and culture orally through storytelling?
Can I jump in?
Always.
Sorry. I don't want to quote unquote hog the mic. What I love about that question is something that I just dealt with. I was doing a workshop in St. Louis, Missouri, with a group of elementary school and middle school students, and the pianist was from Havana in Cuba, and so we demonstrated music from all over the Caribbean, and a student, one of the kids, at the end of the class, because I asked if anybody was familiar with any of these cultures, and the student, nobody put their hand up, and after a student came up and tugged on my shirt and said, "My dad is Cuban," and it was really moving to me because I immediately saw that young person get empowered about a culture that they probably never saw outside of the household. And what administrators need to understand, which a lot of them do, but many forget, is that America is the land of immigrants. And so many people here are taught and sometimes forced to culturally assimilate based on what they think is cool or trying not to quote unquote stick out. I've seen students rapidly lose their accents. I've seen students change the way they dress, change the way they interact, simply because of they're trying to fit in. And the one thing that's really important is that we are empowering people to embrace their own culture. But the next thing that is important for is teaching the other students in the classroom to be respectful and appreciative and understand that it's one plane as opposed to this like jagged hierarchy of steps. To understand that it's one plane, that it's one circle of cultures in a classroom. And that's what and that is the benefit of using these stories in the classroom.
Great answer.
I think I was about to say, to add to what Etienne said, which was eloquently put. Even in asking that question, which is not an ignorant one, I think it depicts typical Western educational perspective, and it also it again centers Western educational practices as the norm and as the authority. I think the majority of people on the planet have oral storytelling traditions when it comes to passing along information, singing, dancing, etc. So one, although in this particular context, it may be viewed as other or alien, in many parts of the world, probably the majority, that's the norm, oral storytelling and telling stories from that way. The other thing is, if you are running a school, a nonprofit organization, a business in a community where people's culture has to do with storytelling, and you don't understand the importance of storytelling, I think that that draws a deeper question to light about just being culturally responsive. Because again, if we're being culturally responsive and the community you're in, they teach and share through stories, I don't think it should be a question as to its validity or importance. But again, when you're coming from a paradigm where only one is being viewed as the authority, kind of the one that's alien to the community, I think those kind of questions predominate. And again, it's a great question, because in 2020, we're still dealing with issues like that.
Yes, I wanted to just quickly add, I think, I think if administrators and teachers can perhaps try to explain to the administrators that the gift of education and music education to children is that this is an exploration. It's a musical exploration. And that's, again, I go back to here, the beauty of this program at Carnegie. This is a musical exploration of cultures around the world. Our son has his school, they had, an elementary school, they had, around the world in so many days, and in each they had a different country that they explored the food and the people and the policies and made things and, all of this kind of stuff. And I think that administrators, if they look at it in terms of it being a musical exploration, this is what fuels each individual child, their family history when they go home. You can start out raising your hand. Who likes pizza? Who orders Chinese food? Who likes food? Who likes burritos? Who likes rice and peas? Who likes, you can go back. Who likes all of them? And there's a story in each one of these things. There's a story behind that, and so
exactly.
We have to end this the mindset of loving the food and not the people. It's all of us or none of us. So.
I think there's also, I don't know if I have the right language. I'm not a trained educator, but if you need to sell to a higher up, the neurological benefits of singing in unusual rhythms and unusual phrasings and 13 bars and not in the little blocks of 4, but a lot of our music is, or singing and learning different languages expands the brain, as well as, of course, creating, if you're doing hip hop and actually being creative, which is one of the things we see in our school. They don't really have creative writing nearly enough. Just Visa means the creation, and that is clearly pedagogically very, very helpful. I don't most people say and screw the question, but again, I agree with, but if you essentially have to sell that, I think there are a lot of things, as well as just, you want to talk about oral memory. What about working memory? That actually needs we can't rely on our phones for that. So I think there's lots of kind of educational
benefits,
value,
in the terms they thinking.
Agreed.
All right, I know that we're running a little long, but I think I'm just going to attribute it to the fact that we're cooking up all these amazing ideas. So I will take maybe one or maybe two more questions. This one came from Kathleen, which I think is a very good one. She asked, how do we support the students diving deeper into a culture than simply cultural voyeurism, something that you mentioned earlier, Chen? How do we help them avoid setting up the us versus them mindset? And maybe we want to hear from someone who we haven't heard from in a while to start.
That's key. One thing I think, I agree with Julia, and I think everybody here, is that these musical traditions they're older and deeper than any one of us can actually understand. And so I think, I thought it was so interesting, Julia. You said that you've been doing bomba since you're 2, but you still feel like you're a student. And I feel like the more I've learned about Georgian traditional music, the more I realize I don't actually know. Like it's just such a complex system with so many different language pockets within Georgia. And so I think that having this sort of beginner's mindset is really important. And maybe as an educator, you might feel somewhat like you have to have a sort of sense of authority about it. But I think it's actually a lot more honest to tell your students that you too are learning about it, and I certainly feel really confident in saying that to people that I'm working with. And I think when we approach the music with that real kind of like not trying to say that you understand it and here you are, like you're going to teach it to everybody, but rather that we're all exploring it together. I think that's really important. And B is what everybody else has been saying is context. The context of the music is just as important as the notes themselves. And that kind of ties in exactly to the story element of it. I mean, I had a friend literally text me earlier today and said that they had tried Georgian food for the first time in the last couple of days, and that they feel like they understand Georgian music better than they ever had before. They had listened to it, they had even sung some of it, but tasting the food really made this music kind of like give it a different color, So I think those two things are really important: is the context and that sort of beginner's mindset.
If I may add to, communities, whether it's in the classroom or in different parts of the US, are more and more diverse. And I love the idea this morning, Dr. Khani, when she was sharing about allowing the student to become the teacher. And I think there are, in our communities, a lot of locals are there that come from different traditions, and why don't we ask them to participate in the teaching process of our students, and hopefully as well with the resources that will be shared during this next week, that it will allow the teachers to really get some important resources and things to go back on when they're preparing and kind of changing and working their curriculum to allow for more of that, deeper diving into a culture rather than just kind of a slideshow that tells you a bit on. And kids usually love stories, they connect to stories, and they relate more to people than it is to anything, to just a song and so on. So I think making use of the community that we have in the classroom and outside of it would be vital.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Laith, and thank you so much, everybody, for your insight, your perspective, your thoughts, everything. This, as I said before, when we started, this is only the beginning. This is the tip of the iceberg, and we're really excited that we get to spend so much time with you over the next week to hear more from you. So, teachers who are listening, this is not the end. Don't definitely go over to Slack to continue these conversations, ask more questions. These sessions are going to raise even more questions, so we encourage them so that we can continue these conversations. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great one. All right.
Take care, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.